So I guess I'll kind of start at the very high level, right? So with the PowerShell scripts in general, um, I used to use this PowerShell ISE software, which comes installed typically on Windows Server, and it's a good option for developing in PowerShell. Um, Once it decides to open here for us, so it's a good option. Um, but it's not perfect, right? Like it has some little issues here and there. But this is what I used for many years to do the PowerShell development because that was really the main option available. In more recent years, though, Microsoft has been doing a lot of stuff with this Visual Studio Code um, software, which is free. It's not like Visual Studio Professional. This one's more lightweight and supports a lot of different programming languages and more general purpose. So you could just kind of think of it like a text editor on steroids. Um, so what's nice about this one is that you have integration with version control. You can navigate between your files pretty easily after you open up a folder. And then within the files, you have some nice features like I can control click on a function and kind of dive deeper to where that function's defined. So you can navigate like that a little bit more easily. And then here on the right side, you kind of have some just general features, right? Control F, you could do find replace, um, little features that come in handy in addition to being able to actually debug a script too if you need to. Um, but I guess before I get into all that, um, when I start kind of uh, wanting to put code on a server that's PowerShell related, we've started to kind of break things up into subject areas, right? So this server is kind of dedicated to just the Starfish stuff. So in the C code folder, and this is just um, my way of doing it, right? I just tend to create a code folder right there in the C drive. And then in this case, I have a starfish scripts folder. And inside of this, right here in the root, we have the kind of like the main configuration file. Um, the configuration.example is really just there as a starter. But like, let's say if I had shared this with you and it was kind of blank as a starting point, you might only have the example. So you would copy this and rename it to configuration.psd1, and then you might fill it in with credentials that you might need or whatever. So you could see here in the example that most of the stuff's kind of filled in, but like for example, like the banner password and stuff is not actually present. So that's the difference between the example versus the kind of like the real one. So I put the configuration here in the root. And then in addition to that, there's this common module, which I tend to use across the different servers. And it mainly has a couple of common functions. So that includes a function for sending notification emails, for logging to the command line and to a string that we can include in our email, and some basic checks for checking if the files are empty, testing Oracle connections and Active Directory connections, and yeah, so it's pretty light. There's not that many functions in here, and really the top two are the ability to send a notification email and the logging, which I use all over the place. So aside from the common module and the configuration, then I'll start creating folders depending on what system typically I'm kind of interfacing with. So this one is the Starfish piece, which is our related to the data pump of sending data up to Starfish. And that's where all these files are located. Within a topic area like Starfish, I'll have a module And this will contain all of the helper functions that are used across all of these files. And then this text folder, you'll see that pop up every so often in the various scripts. And those typically hold, let's say, a generated text file, right? That gets created as part of the script's execution. So this is the first stop for those starfish files. So they get created here, and they have all their data in the format that starfish needs them to be in. This other topic area for the exporter is a little bit different setup. It actually works a lot differently in comparison to some of our other scripts. So you could see it's quite simple in it just having like this one file here. And then a lot of it kind of relies on where the files come in, because it's kind of backwards. So this is really Starfish exporting data to us, and it appears in a local folder somewhere else on the hard drive here. And that's kind of where we work with it. So, and that relies on some SQL loader scripts that Alex had put together originally. So this loader pretty much just calls those and runs them. So it doesn't really need like a module folder or anything like that. So aside from our code folder, one thing I learned a couple years ago is that Oracle provides their odp.net library as like a little download, and you can download that zip file, and then inside of it is just this DLL. And in reality, if you want PowerShell to talk with Oracle, all you need to do is let it know about where this DLL is. I don't have to install the Oracle Instant Client. I don't have to add it to the server path. I don't have to do any of that. And the way that works is right here at the top of each of the files. We have this add type, and then we're passing in a path that we have in the configuration. And that path is this one right here. So it's just C odp.net and then the name of that DLL, because that's where it's located. I guess I do have a little bit of the instant client regardless, but that's because of the SQL loader piece, which is separate. But if we just wanted to write queries and talk to Oracle, we really just need this one DLL, and that's it. So that's the high level bit in terms of basic organization within the folders, the common module, and then how you could get it talking with Oracle is just dependent on this one DLL. Any quick questions on kind of like that part?
Not right now.
You still have to install the Oracle drivers and stuff?
No.
Just I just had DLL.
Yeah, just that DLL. If I just want to write a PowerShell script that's, gonna talk to Oracle, whether that's a select, update, whatever kind of query you would want to run, that DLL by itself is all you need.
And you get that from the Oracle client, or is that?
Let me see if I could pull up. I think I have it in this file here. So this second link here, and I don't think it's going to open on campus. Let me try it again though. I don't know if you recall some of those issues with URLs, but I think this is one of them where it's
blocked.
Yeah, it's probably a European server or something. So I'm opening it here at home. Let's see.
So do you have to update that DLL from time to time? Or?
I mean, considering how quickly like the releases come out on the Oracle side, which is really not that often, and then how quickly we get to the current release, it's not really required.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right.
But like here is the page to grab the file. So like if you download this package, and then this package is actually a zip file, even though it doesn't have that extension.
Mm-hmm.
So if you right click on it, just like it says here,
Oh,
if you right click on it and open it up in 7-zip, you can see all the files that it contains. And really that
oh,
DLL is right there and you could pull it out.
got it. Got it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I
All right.
think that might have been the original article I even read back at back when I learned about that technique. So
Cool.
um so going from that kind of starting point, initially all these scripts of course didn't exist, so we would have started with a new script and a new use case and kind of just went from there. Um, the typical structure within the files is kind of the following. So we have the dependencies at the top. So here you see, okay, we have the odp.net library. We also have the dependency on the common module and the starfish helper module. And that's pretty much it. Um, so, and here at the top, this is how we get the configuration info connected. And then I grab the current path that we're in. That way I could always use like relative paths within the folder. So that's what these first two lines are for. Uh, I was sharing with Jeff and Alex earlier that one thing I ran into as like an issue early on when I started writing PowerShell scripts is that sometimes you would maybe be working on an update within a module and then you'd rerun your script and it didn't seem like that updated code was in effect. So that's kind of why I started adding a remove, like an explicit remove here. Um, and that would be because, like, let's say if I was debugging in the middle of this file, I would have imported my module here, all those functions. But since I never get to the end of the file, it would never remove the modules at the end. So these extra lines at the top just kind of help ensure that we remove them first and then we import them. And then that way, every time you run the script, it should have the latest and greatest for the modules you're depending on. So that's the top section. And then we typically have the function itself that we're building, like the task that we want the script to provide. And then down here at the bottom with the dot and then the name of the function and maybe any parameters, this is where it actually executes. So it runs itself basically at the end of the script. So it defines, we have the definition for it, and then we run it. And then at the very end of the process, we remove the modules that we used. Any questions on that kind of basic structure?
Nope.
So moving into the function, we have parameters, right? So just like any function that you'd be writing, you might have some sort of input that you might want to change the mode of how that function is run or what it returns. So that's where these two come in. And that's mainly because so many of these third-party systems have like a test or sandbox environment, and then they have a production environment. So especially early on when we were implementing Starfish, we might have been focused more on that sandbox environment. So a lot of these executions of the script might have been going into the test side at first. And then in this case, there's another option for sending the notification email because when we're running this script, since at the bottom, it runs itself twice, once for production, once for test. Well, for the test one, I don't really care to receive an email notification. So that's why that option was added in. From here, just for usefulness purposes, I typically start each script with like getting the current time and then creating a string builder, which gets used together with this write line to log in command line. So this function does two things. It outputs to the console, so I could see it if I run it myself manually. But then in addition, it saves a copy of this, each thing I'm passing in into that log variable. And then at the very end of the script, when we send a notification email, we take that log variable and we kind of include that inside of the email that gets sent. And just to see what that looks like over here, I guess this one was kind of long. Let me see if I can scroll back up. So this is kind of the output that you might see in one of those logs. All right. So, and just to kind of keep it as like uh, pre-formatted type text or with that font of Courier New, since it's an HTML email, if I surround it in the HTML pre-tag at the beginning and the end, that helps to keep it in that sort of format. That way it's not like, that way this doesn't come in formatted in Arial text or whatever by default. So the next parts are just basic logging. Within the beginning of the file, that's usually where I start tapping into the config. So I start pulling out values that we have in there. So this is pulling out the banner user, the banner password, and all those. And then I create local variables, typically just to make it easier so that I don't have to refer to it by the long name all the time. And some information on the email address, which will come later with the email notifications. And then we have the Oracle test. So this comes into play as a common kind of need because, well, let's say this script is set to run every hour, for example. Well, typically, banner, how it kind of goes down between like 1 and 4 a.m. Well, if we're running this script at 2 a.m., let's say, connecting to the database might fail during that time. So we want to have a little short circuit so that it doesn't care, right? Like it'll just skip execution that time around and try again next time. So that's what that test is for. These calls to new item allow you to create directories and files. So I'm just creating the path names here that I want to use and then creating those there. Alex asked a good question about why some of these have void in front of them. And the reason for that is that sometimes these calls might output something just kind of random, right? Or sometimes they might even output an error and it's not really an error that you care about. So adding void in the front just kind of helps avoid that output from coming in. And going to Betsy's question, from here to here, this is a function that's actually going to go and start retrieving data from Banner. So this is where those queries that she had helped out with, way back when in 2014, when we started using Starfish, would come into play. I don't think it's used specifically for this one. I think it's more for maybe the demographics or one of the other ones that the MIS one would have originally been used for. if I control click, I can go into this and I could see the detail. So here at the beginning, we're just creating the connection for the query. And then here's the query itself, right? So that's actually just being saved into a string variable so that it could be passed into this Oracle command piece and then executed. So that way the server, runs the query. After the query is executed, we get a reader object. And something I was sharing with Jeff and Alex earlier is that quite often with PowerShell, or at least in the examples that I would see as a new user, I would see a lot of folks or examples online that are using simple like lists and arrays, the type that are just numeric, right? Like item 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, can be values X, Y, Z, and whatever. But typically having a list like that is not as useful as an actual hash table where you can have keys and values associated with each other. And so that's why pretty much everywhere when I'm pulling data out of the database, I use a hash table instead. So we start looping through the rows here. And in these cases, I'm kind of making slightly nicer versions of some of the things. I'm creating a display name here, just pulling out a couple extra values. But this is where it actually gets added into the hash table. And the key in this case is the PITM, which actually comes in handy later because Starfish was kind of specific in certain situations where they would say like, okay, we want the rows in the CSV output to be ordered by PITM, for example. And if you have values in the key like that already, it's a lot easier to sort by key that way and a little bit faster. So, and the rest here is just the names. These are the keys we're going to save inside of each object, and these are the values from the query itself. And then at the end of this process, it just returns that hash table, which has all those users we pulled from the database. Was there any question on this part of it? Nope. Okay. So switching back, we pulled our data, and then the rest of this is not too bad. We actually kind of have a second stage here, but this is related to a lot of the stuff that Melody and Abelardo kind of took over there more recently, which is a file that we have over on the code server. And it has some extra relationships type data that they maintain over there. And we pull that in as well and kind of integrate it into the overall data set. So that's a separate step. But from there, we do the sort object by name, which is where that PITM key value kind of comes into play. So that allows us to take all the rows, sort them by name, and then for each of those, we're doing this select object thing, which looks a little complicated, but this gives us the flexibility to provide the names we want to use for the CSV output or the text output. So we're providing the names, and then we're saying, okay, for each of our row values, and we're putting them into place there as the output for each of those columns. So that's what all this is here. And then once we kind of have all those things in the format we want, we're also passing it into that export CSV option here and providing a path to where we want the file to go. And then once that file is generated, really the last spot here is that we move it from our project folder over into like where Starfish wants it to be, which is in another folder. And the rest of this is just extra info, start and time calculations and, little messages there. And then if we did some work, then we send the notification out. And then this part at the end, we kind of went over already. But yeah, that's the pretty typical structure for the scripts. Really the meat and potatoes is here in the middle area after we kind of do our little basic checks on whether or not we can connect to Oracle and we set up our configuration stuff. Depending on how complex that task is, this middle part could be longer, shorter. And then it also helps depending on, how well we break it up into those module functions that are over in the Starfish helper module.